So today I'm back with yet another If You Like This Book, You Should Read That One. Yes, it's a classic video, but I love it for a reason because when I read a book I really enjoy, I want to read something like it, or if I read something that I think I'm going to enjoy and it totally falls apart, sometimes I want a similar book that is going to redeem that premise and do it better than the first one. So if you enjoy this kind of thing, hopefully you stick around, subscribe, let's get started. First, let's talk about the Ranger of Marazana, and this is the first book in an epic fantasy series that starts out with a brother and sister. Right at the beginning of the story, I think in the first chapter, you have the horrific murder of their father, and this sets the siblings onto a path of revenge and action. And so one sibling goes off to fight with the rebellion, and one ends up fighting on the side of the empire. And with that setup, you get the siblings on opposite side of the conflict, and it really tears their family apart. This is a premise that I absolutely adore. Anytime you get either siblings or best friends that are put on different sides of the conflict and have to fight against each other, I am completely here for it. And the cover of this book, as well as all the other books in this series, are absolutely gorgeous, but I fully admit that this is one of my least favorite Orbit titles that I ever had a chance to read and review. I really didn't like it. I found the character work, the plotting, everything to be so flat, and the character motivations in my mind just did not make sense. And so I was horribly disappointed, but thankfully Orbit actually had another book series come out that to me had a very similar premise but worked so much better. And so the book I want to recommend instead of that is Ashes of the Sun by D'Angelo Wexler. And this is another epic fantasy story that starts out with two siblings. There's an incident at the beginning of the story and the sister is taken away. And so she is trained in a certain form of fighting. And then you also have the brother who goes and trains as well in a different order. And little do you know that of course they are on different sides of the conflict and they have to come to terms with that. So as you can see from the synopsis, it's clear why I'm connecting these two books together, because the setup for these books is very, very similar. I will be totally honest, I had to look online to double check which synopsis was which before filming this, because I constantly get the setup confused as to which book had the death of the father, etc. But from there, thankfully, this one takes a different turn. I found this book to be very engaging with good characters. I've said it before and I'll say it again, that this book definitely feels reminiscent of Star Wars. I'd be shocked if I learned that the author did not draw inspiration from them, because there's basically Jedis in this book. The son goes and learns how to be a Jedi in this world. They're just not called Jedi, but they have lightsabers and all of that. And then you kind of have the sister on the other side of the conflict and so forth. And again, it's a premise I love, and so I was really happy that it actually worked well in this one. It was very engaging, and there is more to this series, which I have finished up now. And I do recommend it if you love something that's just very adventure-based, very fun, with perhaps a familiar tropey story, but one that is just good to go along with for the ride. This is one that you might want to check out, especially if you were also disappointed by the Ranger of Marazana. Next, let's talk about Nevernight by Jay Kristoff, which is a very popular, beloved book on BookTube that follows a woman who is trained to be an assassin. And the book is very well known for having a very distinct narrative style, where the book is filled with footnotes, and it also has just a very casual, funny, humorous style to it, even if there is a lot of violence and action within the story. So I want to pair it to a book that perhaps has a different plot and premise, but in terms of narrative structure, it's a good comparison. So if you love the style of Nevernight, I would recommend The Rune of Kings by Jen Lyons, which is the first book in a series that is called The Chorus of Dragons. And so this one, again, does not really involve assassins. Instead, we follow a young man who is a thief. He is kind of a nobody on the street. And right at the beginning of the story, he finds out that perhaps he is someone, perhaps he is related to this royal who has been outcast, and gets pulled into this larger adventure. As the title of the series suggests, this is a story that's told over multiple points of view, and so we follow the story through these individuals' eyes. It's so hard to summarize because there's so much going on. There is a lot of talk of reincarnation and people becoming others through that process. And so within the story, we follow this main character, but also these other individuals along the way. There is a heavy emphasis on relationships. There's a lot of queer discussions within the story. There are different nations and different cultures that have different ideas surrounding sexuality and gendering. So I will say in terms of setup and premise, 100% it's very different than Nevernight, but once again, it's a story that uses the narrative voice in a very distinct way, and particularly once again uses footnotes to add humor and extra information to the story. So this is one that I recommend doing on audio, which is how I did both Nevernight and this series, because I found that when it comes to footnotes, it works best if you can listen and have it kind of woven into the story. I personally find it very distracting when you're reading a book and then have to go back and forth. And so while I enjoyed this one a little bit more than Nevernight due to my personal taste, I will say that they had similar feels. And again, if you love footnotes in stories, if you find that super fun to parse through, this is another series you might want to check out. Next, let's talk about Perdido Street Station by China Mieville. This is a piece of weird sci fantasy that is set in this dirty city of New Chromosome, where we follow this scientist named Isaac. He is in a relationship with this womanly creature who is not human, and within the story he is contacted about his research and experiments and gets the opportunity to do something. It's a story you really want to experience for yourself. I tend to give not too many details in terms of the premise and setup because I feel like it kind of happens a little bit later into the story. But what this is just this great story of this place that has a lot of discontent. There are different groups, as I mentioned, those that are not human, and so there is a lot of prejudice and classism, and with that comes this feeling of resistance and rebellion as those are trying to fight for their position. This book, especially later into the book, gets into some elements of body horror and some elements that are just very visual to the reader. You will have pictures in your mind as you're reading this, and it definitely is a book that sticks with you. It's very unique, so I'm happy that I actually have a book that gave me similar vibes. And that book, of course, is Shadow of Short Days, which is a book I've recommended so many times on my channel, but I will keep doing so until you all read it. This is a piece of epic fantasy that is inspired by Iceland, where the author is from. In the story, we follow a few different perspectives, one being a man who is attending a magic school. We also have an artist who is involved in a rebellion. You find out within this world that people are able to use forms of art, even things like graffiti, to imbue and create magic. And so that is tied into the story. And once again, this is set in a world where there are those that are seen as lesser and they are fighting for their place in the world. So once again, you have the grittiness of the world set in that urban setting. And then in that dissatisfaction, you get the push for change. And the story turns into, again, a little bit more of a horror story as it goes on. Some weird speculative elements. It is dark. There are content warnings. There's really tough stuff going on. But I really like it. And it's crazy to have a book that can be anything like Perdido Street Station. But this is probably one of my closest recommendations. And carrying along with that, let's talk about The Scar by China Mieville. This is another book that is set in the same world as Perdido Street Station, but you can read it as a companion. If you intend to read both the books, I do recommend doing it in order because you'll be slightly spoiled for some of the details that are more explored in book one. But if you just want to start here, you absolutely can. This story is set out in the sea, and we follow someone who is hired to work on the ship, and through that there are revelations that come to be, again, a book that is so hard to summarize, and I feel like anything I say would be spoilers, but it's a book that has, again, that weird fancy element to it, but is set in the sea. And so the book I want to recommend in pairing to this is probably a cheat, but I'm going to do it anyway, and that is The Storm Beneath the Sun, which is a sequel to The Shadow of Short Days. And this, again, is a companion story that can, in this case, absolutely be read as a standalone. So while the first book is set in a city, this book is once again set in the sea. We follow a woman who is traveling across the sea with their child, and they have to figure out what is going on, and the story goes from there. The characters are completely different. There's really very few tie-ins, but I love the author's work. I found it very jarring to read this, expecting it to be similar to the first one, but what it reminded me of was The Scar. So I do recommend these two books fit very well together. They are kind of this weird fantasy mashup that is very meandering and slow and has, of course, that sea setting with these characters going through their journey and discovering things along the way. So if there's ever a book that I would compare to The Scar, it would be this one here. Next, let's talk about The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, which of course is a very popular book, so you probably know, but this is the first book in a series that is yet to be complete, but we follow a young man who is telling his story. So as the story opens, he is in this bar and is telling how he became known as the King Killer. However, the story, for the most part, at least the first book, is set back in his days at school where he is still learning his craft and finding out how he came to be the man that he is well known for. This is such a beloved one for its beautiful writing and all of that. And so the book I want to compare it to is one that might be a bit controversial here, so hear me out, and that is The First Binding. Now, this is a story that is framed around someone who is once again telling their story. The story is talking all about the importance of storytelling and how it is so vital that we share our stories, and in a way how kind of stories shape the truth and vice versa. And so we have someone who is telling their story once again. Now, I'm fully aware that not everyone is going to love this pairing because The First Binding is very hit and miss with readers. Some people love it because it is very similar to Name of the Wind, and other people hate it because they do consider it to be a copycat or a ripoff of that story. In my mind, it is way too close, given the fact that it's clearly published afterwards, and so the author had the opportunity clearly to read the Kingkiller Chronicles as has been published, and probably want to take advantage of the fact that readers are unsatisfied that the series isn't finished and are maybe looking for something similar with the hope that that other series will get done. And so I read that book. I'll be honest, I thought it was too long and too repetitive and too similar to the Name of the Wind series, which admittedly, while I don't love, I don't think it's my favorite series out there. But I will say that if you love that setup, if you love that premise, if you just want more, if you've read Name of the Wind 100 times and its sequel and are impatiently waiting for another book, this is one you might want to check out because it is very similar. The argument is whether or not it's too similar, which I'll leave up to you in the discussions and comments. And I also want to talk about Sufficiently Advanced Magic by Andrew Rowe. This is a piece of indie fantasy that follows a young man who at the beginning of the story is going through the trials in order to get into a magic school. He wants to learn the crafts of this world, but he also wants the ability to find his brother who years ago disappeared in the same towers where he is getting his opening to go to the magic school. And so within the story, most of it takes place after he actually gets into the school, so it deals with the usual magic school tropes. And within the book, you also have him dealing with some mental challenges. So specifically, he deals with his anxiety, which is central to the story and plot. And then, of course, this book is very well known for having some hard magic system within it so that you learn a lot about how the magic works, which is gone through in great detail there. This is a book or a series that definitely has some potential. I like the first books most, but I'm hopeful that the series will kind of pick up in the later books again. This is a book that I want to compare to Dragon's Mate, which is another indie fantasy book. In this one, we follow a young man who happens to be on the autism spectrum. He is obsessed with knot making, which little did you know in this world happens to be a major component to magic and how it is worked and imbued in objects. So within the story, we follow a mage who comes to his town and realizes that this young man has incredible talent and takes him under his wing as his apprentice. From there, he learns the trade and learns to work his abilities. So once again, you kind of get a little bit softer. It's not quite as intense of a hard magic system, but you learn that the different knots do different things. And so I love those little aspects of the story and kind of learning the details and ins and outs of all of that. The two books definitely reminded me of each other because of the fact that they deal with some different aspects of mental health and neurodiversity that isn't always talked about in other fantasy stories. So again, the first one, it is anxiety. And then of course, the second story is more about atypicalness, where you have someone on the spectrum. I felt like the representation in both cases was fairly well done. These books also have young adult or all ages appeal. While they are both technically classified as adult, which is my preference when it comes to reading fantasy, they are technically the kind of book that could completely work for a young adult audience. Both the books lack any kind of mature content in terms of sex scenes or anything like that, and happen to shy away from swearing or any things that kind of make a book more objectionable to a teenage audience. So if you like one, I do think you should check out the other one. I think that they have a lot of similarities, a lot of things that I enjoyed in one, I enjoyed in the other. And it's a series where you're very much watching a character come of age, so you want to kind of read through the later books and see kind of how it progresses down the road. Finally, let's talk about Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. And this is a piece of epic fantasy that is set in a world that is inspired by a lot of pre-Columbian indigenous groups. So we follow individuals as they are leading up to this event. There is going to be a solar eclipse, and so we're following a group that are traveling on the sea to get there. There is a woman who is more of a siren. She has the ability to speak with the sea, and she is tasked with bringing this man across the sea. He has indigenous heritage and possibly this great destiny that he is meant for. This is a book that really appeals to me in terms of the world building because it is very unique and different than anything I've read, but it's definitely the kind of book you want to read more than once because the author does not spoon feed you the details of how the world works, and instead you have to kind of figure it out for yourself. And they don't necessarily just give you all the information up front, at least not in the first book. And so you really do have to work your way through it. And reading that book, I got similar vibes when I picked up another book, and that one is The Archive Undyne. Now, technically this is a science fiction book, but it's sci fantasy, so I do think that it still works for this video. In the story, there are these gods that reign and rule over cities, and right at the beginning of the story, one of the gods goes crazy and starts to destroy the city. However, in doing so, it wakes up this young man who is almost in this state of being undead or not alive. He was more of a ghost, and in doing so, he's become alive and now has to figure out what this all means and where to go from there. This book does have a heavy relationship aspect to the story, which is not going to be for everyone. There's a queer romance that is very central to the story and plot and plays a large role, but if you like Black Sun, there is also a heavy romantic element in that one, so if you can tolerate it there or like it there, you'll like this one as well. So it's woven into the story, it's very character focused, and particularly what reminded me of it is, again, the world building, which is this really cool concept, but it's a story where you're almost grasping into the air trying to understand everything that's happening, because the author doesn't really give you all the details, at least up front, and so it's so fascinating, but you just want to know more. And I kept rereading thinking, oh, I'm missing something, and I'm like, no, I just don't know more at this point in the story. And so if you love that experience when you're kind of working your way through a book that is very intriguing but is holding back on you as a reader, that is the experience I got. And I gotta say that I probably am not the only one who thought that these two books were interconnected, because the audiobook narrator for this book happens to be the same one who is used in the Black Sun series. So I think that other people realize that readers who love that one will probably love this one as well. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know, of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out? And let me know what you think of my pairings. Do you agree, disagree? And if you have better pairings to go along with these books, I'd love to hear them as well. If you enjoyed this, hopefully you stick around and subscribe. I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy, and other dark things. And if you want to help me out with this video, you can give me a thumbs up, you can share it around online, you can drop a comment, even if it's just an emoji like a dragon. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.